As Americans, we have been programmed to live a self-indulgent lifestyle. Common expressions like, you only live once, get it while you can, and if you've got it, flown it, have been propounded into us and have become somewhat of a systematic foundation for our everyday pursuits of life. Both children and adults alike will throw their respective fits if they cannot have what they want, present tense. An organization known as Market Watch performed a statistical survey back in the year 2017 on what exactly Americans spend their money on, and here is what they found. Americans spend their money 33% of their income is allotted for housing, 16% for transportation, 13% for food, give or take some. Insurance and pension was 11%, 8% was dedicated to health care, 12% dedicated on average for entertainment and other sources of recreation, 3% for apparel and services, which will become more and more evident as it gets hotter, the less clothes individuals will wear. What this really means for us is that if you were to plug this in terms of a household income, let's just say $75,000 a year, if that is your total whole house income, what that means in simplistic terms for us is that in housing, you would spend somewhere around $24,000 this year. For transportation, you would spend about $12,000, maybe 2 vehicle loans or taking a bus or taxi or Uber or something of that nature. In food, you would spend close to $10,000. Insurance, life insurance and pension savings, you would spend somewhere in the category of $8,000. For health care, roughly $6,000. On entertainment and other sources of recreation, a whopping $9,000, and apparel and services, you would spend just over $2,000. Now, the gist of this message, as you will soon find out, is not to go over just financial principles, but if you were to do the math later on this evening, you would find that if your total household income is $75,000 and you add up all of this and then you figure in that you have to pay taxes out of $75,000, you would find that you are spending about $3,000 more than you actually took in a year's time. But that is America, right? We spend virtually the same amount of money on food, on fun, as we do on food from the survey. More on fun than we do on life insurance and savings. More on fun than we do on clothing and other forms of service. More on fun than a lot of things in our life. And we spend almost as much on fun as we do on transportation in our lives. Now, these particular figures may be a little better in your life, or they may be a little bit more out of whack. You may say, I don't spend $24,000 on housing inside of a year, but I spend a little bit more transportation, or a little bit more in life insurance and savings, maybe more in health care. If you don't have Obamacare, more than likely you spend more in a year on health care than $6,000. And so these are just averages, of course, and can be plugged in particularly inside of your life. The question that we've come to look at together this evening is, should the Christian's life be any different in these regards? These are the average throughout America, what Americans are spending their money on. But as Christians, should our statistics be any different in these particular regards? As we come into Matthew chapter number 16, if we were to break down verses 24 and verse number 25 into fragments for our better understanding, we could find that Jesus' address here to His disciples, to His followers, has a central issue in mind. This issue is termed inside of verse 24 by the terms life and self. And Jesus says to His disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and follow me. Verse 25, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find it. Now those terms, life and self, become very operative then in Jesus' statement to his disciples. Or he might say, instead of life and self, we could say that the issue that lies at the heart of Christ's message here is a self-life. A life lived in self-indulgence. A life lived for one's own self in consideration. The chief characteristic of such a life is possessiveness. In other words, mankind, humanity, generally speaking, lives for what he can call his own, what is mine, what belongs to me in a possessive form. The words gain and profit in verse 26 later on in the text make this very clear. Jesus says, "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Mankind, generally speaking, lives in a pursuit for what he can gain and what will bring to his life a certain sort of profit. Jesus says to destroy this self-life and give up all for Christ's sake is to lose nothing in the end, but to preserve everything unto life eternal. But the very opposite is true as well. Jesus also says that for us to allow the enemy of a self-life to survive in its pursuit of possessions is to eventually and ultimately lose everything that we have held dear. What will it profit then if a man gains the whole world and loses his own soul? In other words, then, the Christian's pursuit is to be characterized by a selfless life. We are not to live in order to save our own lives. We are to live with a relinquished life, a life that is given over into the hands of our Savior, whereby we not only serve our Savior, but we serve others. Paul's message would be something very similar to this, that as much as it lieth in you that we are to live peaceably with all men, and that we are to do good unto all men, especially them that be of the household of faith. Now, you remember Christ's words, right? That if someone asks for your coat, you're to give them your cloak also, right? If someone compels you to go 1 mile with them, you're not to grumble and complain about it, but you're to go an extra mile with those individuals. The idea is that you're not preoccupied with your own possessions. You're not preoccupied with your own schedule, with your own perspectives, but you live a life that is laid out on the altar of sacrifice in simplistic terms. A life then that is not lived for one's own prestige or benefit. Here's what one Christian author said on the topic. There is within the human heart a tough, fibrous root of fallen life whose nature is to possess, always to possess. It covets things with a deep and fierce passion. The pronouns my and mine look innocent enough in print, but their constant and universal use is significant. They express the real nature of the old Adamic man better than 1,000 volumes of theology could ever achieve. The way then, Jesus says, to a deeper knowledge of God inside of our text is through a denial of living for one's own self-gratification or to lose one's life. And this parallels exactly with what Christ taught back in Matthew chapter number 5. At the outset of the Sermon on the Mount, Christ gives to us the attitudes of a genuine believer. We refer to them as the Beatitudes. And in the first Beatitude we read of Matthew chapter number 5, we find that the poor are a blessed people. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." These are the poor in spirit, those that have entered into the kingdom of God genuinely and authentically. Poor in spirit is a defining characteristic of authentic Christianity. A.W. Tozer, the penman, made this statement. He said, "These or such individuals, those that are poor in spirit, have reached an inward state paralleling the outward circumstance of the common beggar in the streets of Jerusalem." So if you were to think about a pauper, think about a poverty-stricken individual that is laid up on the street who has nothing to show for a life that has been lived, a poverty-stricken individual in a physical sense, it becomes a perfect parallel for what it means to be an authentic child of God in a spiritual sense. It means that we are dependent upon God for everything. Everything we have is attributed to the generous contributions that God has already made to us inside of our life. And as such, we own absolutely nothing because we are poor in spirit. So for the poverty-stricken individual, if he eats, it's because God feeds him. If he has, it's because God has supplied. If there is a need met, it is because the good God of this universe has afforded such a need to be met. In simplistic terms, he prays, give us this day our daily bread, because although his pantry may be full, he realizes that God not only gives, but has the power to take away. And so he lives in utter dependence upon God. That is what it means in definitive terms to be poor in spirit. And this is the idea behind the usage, if you will, of the word poor. They are, according to this beatitude, blessed, Christ says, because they are no longer slaves to the tyranny of possessiveness. The paradox here from the beatitude is that in possessing nothing as poverty-stricken individuals, yet they possess more than the whole world could contain, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They're poor in spirit, that is, they are dependent, they have nothing of their own, yet they possess more than this world could ever afford them, because they possess the kingdom of heaven in the bosom of their souls. The whole issue at hand then is simply this: who is sitting on the throne of your heart? Who is sitting on the throne of Stanley Kelly's heart this evening? And this tonight is not just a discussion about how we spend our money or what we do in our spare time or what forms of recreation we enjoy. This is a question tonight of what or who we love most inside of our lives. You care to answer that this evening? Who is it that you love more than anyone else? What is it that you love more than anything else in your life? And it really boils down, according to Christ, to two things. You either love possessions or you love your Creator. One of those two subjects tonight has your chief affection. And it can't be shared, right? And Jesus says no man can serve two masters. He will either love the one and hate the other, cling to the one and despise the other. Man cannot serve what? Both God and mammon. A materialistic possessiveness. You can't serve both. So you're living tonight. I am living tonight for one of these two options. So who do we love most? Who has the chief affection of our hearts? The best illustration of the proposed principle then tonight is probably found in the Old Testament in the narrative of Abraham and his son Isaac. Abraham was old enough to be Isaac's great-grandfather when he had Isaac born to him. And after decades of longing for this child, you remember Abraham wanted a son, wanted a male child more than he wanted anything else inside of his life, and spent years and years, really decades and decades, longing and desiring, coveting after having a son. His desire was so immense that it's portrayed in the Scriptures that Abraham would even go outside of the union of a marriage to one woman and would include in an adulterous relationship with one that was his servant inside of his own house in order to provide for him such a male son. That was wrong. It's not to say it was right, but it does show us just how immensely Abraham desired to have such a son. He has longed for such a son for decades of his life. Therefore, whenever he finally does have Isaac, Isaac would have easily taken the place of chief affections inside of Abraham's heart. Abraham found in Isaac all of his hopes and all of his dreams fulfilled. He watched then as the young child would grow up to be a young man. And as the years passed by, Abraham's affection for his son would have increased, no doubt, to a point where they would have eventually borderlined on a dangerous and idolatrous level. Abraham's love and affection for Isaac would have become so elevated that it would begin striving against Abraham's affection for his God. And just in case you think we're pulling this out of thin air, the event that all of you know that we're trying to build to in Genesis chapter 22, after the test, after the offering up of his only son, the words would come from God to Abraham, "Now I know that thou fearest me above everything else, because you have not withheld your son." The issue of Genesis chapter number 22 is not whether Abraham would just offer up his Isaac. The issue is, who did Abraham love most, his son or his Creator? So the years would pass by, and Abraham's affection would borderline on such an idolatrous level. And here at this particular point then is where God is going to intervene in the narrative of their lives. And He is going to say to Abraham, Genesis chapter 22 and verse number 2, "Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, and offer him upon a mountain that I will show to you." Can you imagine then what that night must have been like for Abraham? Here he is today, and the command comes from God that he is to offer up the chief affection almost of his life, the one that he loves more almost than life itself, and would have at a moment's notice laid down his life for this individual. He was literally the apple of Abraham's eye. And God comes to him and says, I command you to offer your son Isaac upon an altar of sacrifice. Abraham that evening will pillow his head down that night, but more than likely will not find any rest or comfort. Can you imagine what it must have been like for Abram? Not much sleep would have been gained as the stars shined above him on the black canopy. There would have been a great wrestling match. In fact, a greater wrestling match would have never taken place probably after this, between God and man, as Abraham is wrestling with God over this situation. He's tussling with God over rendering obedience to this specific command inside of his life. And then Abraham would have probably thought, if not verbalized, such complaints as this: I can't believe God would require me to do this. I can't believe. Can you imagine what he must have felt in his heart? That this God that he has walked with, this God that called him to leave the land of his fathers, to live in isolation from them, that he has promised to start a new nation with, and all of these blessings have been foreshadowed and promised to him. And now Abraham comes to this place where God is demanding that he offer his son up in a sacrifice. And Abraham is thinking, I can't believe God would ask me to do this, to get rid of what I love most in my life. Possibly he tries to convince himself, maybe I heard him wrong, maybe God doesn't want me to do this, maybe God misspoke, maybe I didn't hear him clearly, but none of that was working for Abraham. He could have wished himself were dead rather than put to death what was so precious to him inside of his life. Throughout that evening, there would become an even deeper issue, a deeper question on Abraham's mind that would plague him, alongside of the fact that he is being called upon to offer up Isaac his son. He would question, what about the promises of God? Remember, God had said to Abraham, in Isaac shall thy seed be called. And so this just adds to the wrestling nature of that night as he tosses and turns and paces back and forth. God, what about the promise? You said that you were going to give me such a seed that it would equal the equivalency of the stars of heaven as the grains of sand upon the seashore. God, if I'm to have that kind of offspring, that kind of a legacy left behind, and that legacy is to be put through Isaac, how in the world is that promise going to be fulfilled if Isaac's life ends here and now? But sometime before the light began to dawn on the horizon the next day, possibly while the moon was still up in the darkness, Abraham comes to a resolution. Excuse me, I promise it's not the coronavirus. Abraham comes to a resolution. The writer of Hebrews and tells us what this resolution was. Abraham would account that God was able to raise Isaac from the dead. So he resolves in himself, I know that I will go to this mountain and I will kill my son, but God will raise him back to life. This is the only logical conclusion in the mind, in the fathomization of what Abraham could conjure up in his mind. And so this fiery trial puts Abraham back into a frame of mind where God again is the faithful one as sovereign Lord of heaven and earth that sits upon the throne, and he is now trusting God yet again to perform the impossible inside of his life. And so the text reads, Genesis chapter 22, early in the morning, they prepared for the journey. You see, tonight, inside of this story, what is being accomplished in Abraham's life is exactly what Christ promises us back in our text of Matthew chapter number 16. That whosoever will lose his life for my sake will find it. And therefore, in losing Isaac, Abraham would find his proper placement in his life. And in losing our lives, we will find our proper perspective on every good gift that God has given to us in our lives. God let Abraham go all the way until the point he could go no further. And then he calls out to Abraham. The Bible tells us, Genesis 22 in verse number 12, as God calls to him to stay his hand, God says, for now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thine only son from me. Do you hear it in the tone of God's voice? God says, finally, at last, Abraham, I know you love me more than you love anything else. You have showed me. I don't know what it was in Abraham's life. I don't know what had happened heretofore, Genesis chapter number 22, but there must have been something that caused God to question in a practical sense whether Abraham's chief affection was God or his son Isaac. And so God puts him through this immense test, and at the end of the test, Abraham comes forth a vessel for the finder, and God says, now I know, Abraham, in practical terms, that you love me more than you love your son. In a sense, then, Abraham lost everything when he yielded obedience to God's plan for his life. When the command comes to him in Genesis 22 to offer up his son Isaac upon an altar, do you think all of Abraham's cattle meant anything to him? Do you think all of his employees, the fact that he was greatly blessed in riches, do you think wealth, do you think money mattered to Abraham at that point in time? Absolutely not. In one fell swoop, Abraham lost everything. But in reality, he lost absolutely nothing. Because in losing himself, he found himself. In reality, he lost nothing. He still had all his cattle. He still had all his possessions, all his wealth, and he even had his beloved son Isaac still to live now a selfless life with. God never intended for Abraham to kill his son. He only wanted to remove Isaac from the throne of Abraham's heart, because that throne belonged to God by himself. This seat was to be reserved for God and God alone, and God had intentions of removing any rival from the close proximity of such a throne. I wonder this evening if God knows this to be true of you and me. I wonder, does God know that we love Him more than we love our children? Does God know that we love Him more than we love our spouse? Does God know tonight that we love Him more than we love our business? Does God know that we love Him more than we love our families, our recreation, our possessions, our homes, our rest? Have you and I made the trip to Moriah with our family and our possessions in our hands and offered them there to show God that we love Him more than we love anything else in our lives? Now, I believe tonight that we fear doing this by and large. We fear doing this for maybe out of disservice to those things that God has given to us. We fear that we would do a disservice maybe to our family members, if we were to give God such a prominent place inside of our life, how disrespectful it must have appeared to Isaac for Abraham to have laid his son down on an altar and to lift a knife upwards above him. But the question tonight is not one of disrespect. The question is one of supremacy. Who do we love the most inside of our lives? And God was not bothered, I believe, by the likes of Isaac, by the existence of Isaac. It was God that had given Isaac to the likes of Abraham. God was bothered by the preeminence of Isaac. It wasn't that Abraham had things. It was that things had Abraham. Things had become the chief affection, namely his son had taken the place of God, or rivaled at least the place of God inside of his life. And God had intentions of making sure that that place was given back to him in wholeness and in sincerity. Abraham was called, as you and I are, to live a selfless life. A life that is devoted to God inside of our lives wholeheartedly. Now, let me just close this evening by making some application by way of some questions. And I don't want you to try this evening to answer these as I give them to you. What I'd love for you to do, if you have pen and paper in hand, is I'd love for you to jot these questions down, and maybe later on this evening when you can get by yourself, or maybe sometime tomorrow or the next day, certainly inside of this week, I'd love for you to get by yourself and maybe use these questions to spawn a conversation between you and God and see how things are measuring up. As God peers into your life, where does He see your chief affections placed? Question number one this evening: who sits on the throne of my heart? Who sits on the throne of my heart? What is the life that I am holding on to with such a firm grip? What is it that is so important inside of my life? What holds the preeminence? What holds the priority of my life, right? What is it? What is so important? What do I love most? Again, who sits on the throne of my heart? Who sits on the throne of your heart? Now, possibly right now, you're probably doing exactly what I told you not to do, and you're answering that, right? And most of us tonight would just casually say, God, right? That's what we've been programmed to say. We love God more than we love anything or anybody else. Well, let me ask you a couple of other sub-questions here. You don't have to write these down. These are free, all right? Is it your love supremely for God then that allows you to miss church? Do you love God so much that you don't have to come to church on a regular basis? Do you love God enough that you will rush out of the door tomorrow morning and not have time to read your Bible? Right? Is God really on the throne of our heart? Do we love God so much that we don't have to be as faithful as we once were when we first come to find His grace inside our life, because we're so mature now we can miss it every once in a while, right? Is it our love for God? Is it the fact that He sits on the throne of our heart that we can kind of dismiss prayer and we can dismiss certain Christian responsibilities inside of our life? Who or what is our Isaac? What is it that is rivaling the very place that God so deserves inside of our life? Question number one: who sits on the throne of your heart? Question number two: what keeps you holding on to this life? What keeps us tonight holding on to such a life? What is it? We have to address that first, right? What holds the chief affection of our lives? We've got to be honest. If a man wouldn't be honest, he could find absolutely no help. And so we come clean, right, before the Lord. We take pen and piece of paper in hand, and we sit in silence, maybe with our Bible open in front of us this evening or tomorrow or the next day, and we ask ourselves this question: who is it that sits on the throne of my heart? And immediately we want to say God, but after time and meditation, we begin coming to ourselves in practical terms and thoughts. We think to ourselves, if God was really sitting on the throne of my heart, would I dress the way I dress? Would I be entertained by the things that I laugh at? Would I go the places I go? Would I see the things that I watch? Would I do the things that I do? Would church be more important? Would Bible study be more important? Would I have the feelings that I have towards the pastor? Would I look at the brethren in the same respect? Would I gossip? Would I talk? Would I backbite? Would I have malice? And so those questions start coming into our mind as we address and answer the first question: who is it that is sitting on the throne of our hearts? And then we move into this second question of what keeps such a person, what keeps such an item on the throne of my heart, what keeps me holding on to my life, saving that life, what keeps me defending the Isaacs of my life, what keeps the preaching at bay, what keeps the altar at bay, what keeps making the right decisions in my life at bay. Why do I love fill in the blank so much? Why do they take the place of God? Why have I drifted far away from God? Why do I feel myself cold and callous towards the things of God? Why do I sit in a meeting like this and the preacher preaches with the same passion and intensity, and folks around me seem to shout and have the level of excitement that I used to have, but I sit here indifferent. I sit here scoffing and mocking and wondering why nothing is taking place. And while it's so easy to blame everyone else around me, for the first time maybe in months, I sit to myself and I ask myself, why do I not feel God anymore in my life? And maybe the answer would come to us that He is far removed from the proper place on the throne of our hearts. What keeps whatever is there in its place? Is it fear? Are you scared to relinquish it? Is it pride? Are you have you gone too far with it on the throne of your heart that pride keeps you from dismissing it? Is it your appearance? Are you used to walking around in that fashion that you fear getting rid of because of your appearance? Is it your reputation? Is it your intellect? Do you suppose yourself smarter than God, that you can love your life and save your life and keep your life all the same, that nothing of such drastic consequences as Abraham faced in his life would ever become possible for you? Who sits on the throne of your heart? What keeps you holding on to this life? Number 3, and we're finished. What danger lies ahead for the object you placed on God's throne? What danger lies ahead for the object you placed on God's rightful throne? Here's where the story, really back in Genesis 22, takes a very interesting perspective for me. In the story of Genesis 22, if there's a man to say was wrong, it would have been Abraham. It is his misplaced affections that really cause everything to transpire inside of that particular narrative. Abraham has a problem loving something else more than he loves God. And eventually, when that runs its course and hits its climax, Abraham will begin putting Isaac before he puts the things of God. And so, if anyone is to blame in Genesis 22, it would be Abraham. Abraham is wrong in his misplaced affections. But Isaac is the one that's laid headlong on the altar. The dagger is lifted up above Isaac's head, not Abraham's. Abraham's misplaced affections threatens the life of Isaac. Let me ask you a question again. What danger lies ahead for the object that you have placed on God's throne? It was Isaac's life that was placed in grave danger because his father's affections were mixed up. So if there is someone else other than God sitting on the throne of our heart, such reality demands our honesty. Because if we turn just an ignorant glance and act as if nothing is amiss inside of our lives, what happens to Isaac? Is there a voice? Right? Is there a do thou the lad no harm that comes to us? Or does Isaac die? Possibly not by the hands of Abraham, but maybe in another fashion. Right? So who is it that God will need to remove from our lives to have our chief affection? What will God need to destroy in our lives to have our chief affection? What will need to be taken away from us for God to have all of us and to sit back on the throne that He deserves in our life? Now listen to me very carefully. Don't make spooky connections, all right? No one supposing that anyone that has passed away that was loved and dearer to you, that God has removed them because you had misplaced affection. But the reality is possible, right? That if we exalt anything above the proper placement of God, that God can move to remove such a person or such a thing. So what is it, again, I ask us tonight, what is it that lays in danger tonight? Because we will not submit ourselves to love God as we should. Is it your business? Is it your health? Is it your finances? Is it certain relationships that we have? Is it recreation? What is it? Is it your child's life? Is it your child's affection? Is it your child's faith? Is it them following through in full faithfulness to the God that loved them and gave Himself for them? What is it? What lies in jeopardy tonight? Fathers, parents, teenagers, children, grandparents. What is it that's in danger tonight? Because we live a self-life instead of a selfless life. You see, the truth here, well, maybe not as eloquently put as some others could do tonight, the truth is still profound for us. That if we save our lives, that is, we guard against anything ever removing the affections of our heart in possessiveness. If we hold on to our lives, Jesus says, you're going to lose them. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but we will lose those lives. But Jesus says, here's the concept that I really want you to live by. If you'll relinquish that to me, put it on the altar to give to me, I'll give it back to you. And you just ensure that you live your life for me. Every child of God is called to live a selfless life. And may God help us to do so. Let's stand tonight for prayer.